Thanks a lot, Steve. And I just want to express my gratitude to all 4 senators who are here inviting me to talk to you briefly. I also want to congratulate all 4 senators for coming together in this election year for doing something as important as what we're now witnessing. So I just give you a couple of takeaways. The Kauffman Foundation, many of you know, is the leading foundation in the world devoted to advancing understanding entrepreneurship. We finance a lot of research. We also do a lot of it ourselves. And 2 things we've discovered in the last 5 or 6 years. Number one, as you see on these charts, we discovered when we analyzed job creation, not by size of firm, but by age of firm, it turns out that nearly all the net new jobs up until the recession were created by firms less than 5 years old. That is not the same as small business. It's new business that creates jobs. The second thing is that on an anecdotal basis, if you look at the major inventions that characterize what it means to be a modern economy, it turns out that they were brought to you and to us by entrepreneurs, not by established businesses. So if you look through American history, it's the telegraph, it's the telephone, it's the car, it's the airplane, the computer, the personal computer, internet search. It's entrepreneurs like Senators Warner and Steve Case that helped advance the internet and also mobile telephony. Of course, we're seeing Facebook today helping change social media. If you look at the things that characterize our lives, they're brought to us by people who take risks. And what we discovered in the course of our research is the last several years since the recession, there are 3 disturbing signs that make us nervous. Number one is the number of startups has declined from the peak of around 500,000 to 600,000 for about a decade to about 400,000 in the last several years. Number 2, the survival rate of new firms has dipped modestly. The 5-year survival rate has fallen from about 50 to 45%. And third, there's a long-term trend of a decline in the number of new employees created by new firms. These trends have to be reversed. And so last summer, we released something on our website. It was basically an outline of something called, or we called, the Startup Act. It had 4 major components that are now reflected in these bills, in this bill. To promote high-skilled immigration. Number 2, to do something about capital access, which largely was accomplished in the Jobs Act, but there's still more to be done in this bill. Third, to accelerate the commercialization of technologies at universities. And fourth, to have regulatory reform that would help new businesses and existing businesses alike. And so we're gratified to see that in this election year, these senators have come together and are helping to fix the economy for all of us, and for that, we at the Foundation, and we think also the American people ought to be grateful. Thank you very much.
The 4 elected officials would like to thank Bob Lighton and Steve Case for adding credibility to our effort in their presence here today, but we'd be glad to respond to questions. Yes, ma'am.
Senator, what are you working with on the House side? And I was also wondering if you talked with Senator Rubio or Schumer. They also have highly skilled immigration bills.
I'd be glad to have my colleagues respond as well, but we are looking for the right collection of House members. I'm a 14-year veteran of the House of Representatives and am looking for allies to pursue this. We wanted to make certain that we had an appreciation, understanding that we could accomplish this in the Senate. We're gaining that confidence and we'll be actively asking a number of our colleagues in the House to pursue the same kind of concepts included in this bill. My colleagues and I have talked to...
Yeah, there are other senators who've got high school immigration bills out there, bipartisan senators. We wanted to launch this because we saw this as kind of stage 2 after the capital access, now around talent and some of the other tax and regulatory and research provisions. I think one of the things we didn't stress is that, and this has some controversy to it, but the idea that we would try to spur our universities to think more aggressively about how you move research into commercialization. So we look forward to working with other colleagues who've already put markers down as well.
Yes, sir.
You talk about getting things done in a political year. Each of the presidential candidates, the process says that they're not supposed to agree on things. Let's assume you want each of your respective parties' candidates to win in November. Does this mean that there isn't that much of a chasm between President Obama and Governor Romney in terms of job creation ideas? Or is there still a lot of gap to bridge?
Well, let me answer that in this way. One, I've had a conversation with Governor Romney about the Startup Act, and the concepts included in this legislation is something he indicated he found appealing and would be supportive. We have Steve with us from the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness. We know the President signed legislation, the Jobs Act. I think we often focus so much attention on the differences and we fail to address the things that are accomplishable. And it would be surprising to me to find that either President Obama or Governor Romney would find fault with the provisions contained in this legislation. It goes back to what my colleagues, Senator Rubio and Senator Coons, sitting around the Senate late one night, concluded there's lots of things in which there is broad general agreement. My guess is that the most controversial provisions in this legislation relate to immigration. They relate to visas. And what I would say is, and it's related to your question about the divisiveness of politics, I would guess that 80% of my colleagues in Congress would agree with the visa provisions in this legislation. And what I would encourage is that we not take the attitude or approach that unless we do everything, we can't do anything. And I think that's the same kind of attitude I would expect from the Republican and Democrat contenders for the United States presidency is, at this point in time, with the economy and the circumstance it is in, and with the global competitiveness that's there, we ought to do the things that we can do. And again, 80% of my colleagues, at least in my estimate, would find the things that are suggested by the four of us as accomplishable.
On this line, traditionally, H-1B visas, high skill visas have been held as bargaining chips by Democrats for a broader immigration reform and for lower skilled workers. Are the Democrats, Senator Warren, dropping that as a bargaining chip? And Senator Rubio, would you consider combining this with the DREAM Act to at least address both ends of perhaps
To the last question, there are still significant differences, obviously, between President Obama and Governor Romney and between the governing philosophies of the two parties. To suggest that simply because we're jointly introducing a bill that has some solid common ground, we've done away with all partisanship, obviously, would be overreaching. I think it is partly because bipartisanship, real bipartisanship on substantive policy is so rare that you're all here. On immigration, that's one of the great challenges, is that there have been sort of offsetting, we'll hold this until you make progress on this, we'll hold this until you make progress on that, dynamics within the long-term effort here to see comprehensive immigration reform. As Senator Warner said before me, I too am a co-sponsor of the DREAM Act. I too believe we ought to have family reunification provisions. I'm on several other bills, but we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. On the tax provisions in this bill, to go back to the Jobs Act, which passed, which was about capital access for startup companies. It didn't pass through the House and Senate without controversy. It was hotly debated on the floor. But with presidential leadership and with active sponsorship by the leadership of the House and the Senate, we were able to move forward some genuinely good ideas about capital access. It's my hope that similarly, we can show the American people that even in the midst of a very hotly contested presidential election, we can find some consensus that moves pieces of immigration reform forward. Obviously not all of it, but important pieces so that we don't miss another year or two or three in the global competition for talent.
Senator
And
Walker,
just, go ahead. Did you want to finish?
yeah, you want to finish?
Well, let me just add one other item again. Just the fact that I also support comprehensive immigration reform, co-sponsor of the DREAM Act. We got to grow jobs. And the data is overwhelming. At some point, you gotta, some of this stuff does go back to numbers and data, and the notion that we would continue to allow or continue to kind of almost accelerate large American-based companies moving additional research facilities abroad because, one, we don't have enough American-born talent, and two, the talent that we're training we can't hire here, and with those jobs and the ancillary jobs that go along with them, to me, would be short-sighted.
What was your questioning? No, I'm kidding. Just I would add to that a couple of things. This is the process of putting this together is actually pretty simplistic. I mean, this is a collection of really good ideas that have come up from people that have started businesses and know what it takes to start a business, and from people that spend a lot of time thinking about starting businesses. This is a collection of, you'll go over a bunch of the ideas they come up with. We arrived at a bunch that we agree on, and we put them together in a piece of legislation. There are plenty of things for Republicans and Democrats to debate about. That's why we have elections. Sometimes it seems like that's why we have Congress. And I think that process is going to continue. But I think on the things we agree on, we should do them. You asked me about one issue in particular. I do not anticipate that the issue of how to help children who are in this country undocumented through no fault of their own is one of those issues that would be included in a package such as this. I think that's a meritorious issue. I think it should be dealt with separately, and I think that that's where it will be dealt with.
Senator Moran, besides the immigration and the capital gains components, what is it in this proposal that will get people to start hiring more and to start bringing workers back from overseas in addition to creating an entrepreneurial aspect?
Well, remember, we've talked about, and most of, again, back to the earlier question, most of the recommendations here, I think almost all of them, not only came from Kaufman, but also came from the President's Jobs Council. So the first piece was access to capital. And we've seen a tremendous response from the entrepreneurial and technology community about the Jobs Act. So this takes on talent. It takes on some additional tax treatment provisions to help those startup companies get started in those early years. It says, how do we spur research into commercialization? How do we get it into the laboratory, into the marketplace? So all of these things, since the challenge with startup companies is it normally takes a few years for them to get going. But if we don't plant those green shoots right now, we won't benefit from the tremendous job growth that we've seen historically. This graph is pretty darn compelling. You know, why would we not accelerate where the jobs are being created? That's what we're doing.
What's the outlook for how does it look, guys? Do you think you can get this thing passed? How does it look? Are there any hearings?
We're going to let Steve Case is going to give the description.
We got 4 votes for sure.
Well, just a couple of points reflecting on the last few questions. First of all, I should point out that the President's Jobs Council I'm honored to serve on and chair the group focused on entrepreneurship and high growth companies is a bipartisan group. It really was. It's led by Jeff Immelt, the CEO of General Electric, and I think a couple dozen people have done great work on a variety of topics, but it really was bringing a fresh bipartisan perspective to it. The second is when we made the recommendation to the President, I believe it was in October, we laid out a whole framework to make sure we got our entrepreneurial agenda in this country right and could compete globally and remain the world's most entrepreneurial nation. There are a number of components to that. The most important we emphasized then was this issue of winning the battle for talent. Ultimately, our companies, our organization, our countries only as good as our people, and making sure we have the best and brightest, starting the companies that really can grow is based on those recommendations, the first thing that got momentum was this Jumpstarting Our Business Startups Act, the Jobs Act, which focused on access to capital. And it's very important. There are a lot of companies in a lot of different regions and a lot of different sectors of this country that are desperately in need of capital, and crowdfunding will help. The IPO on-ramp will help. But now we need to build on that. The job is not done, even though that Jobs Act passed. And Startup Act 2.0 kind of takes it to the next level. And when we were talking about the Jobs Act, one thing I heard from people talking on Democrats and Republicans and the Senate and the House is like, why are you spending time on this? This is not going to happen. Nothing's going to happen this year. It's an election year. It's like you can't. What are you doing? But we were able to build a bipartisan coalition. A bunch of people who are American citizens spoke out as well. There was a lot of online social media activity around this, and it created momentum and put some pressure on the process. So my hope is the same thing will happen again. And obviously, now we're a little closer to November. It is an election year. It gets more difficult to get things done. This issue of talent, because it is tied in most people's mind with these broader immigration issues, do become more complicated. But we've got to focus on making sure we're the world's most entrepreneurial nation. We cannot be complacent. Other people are stepping up, putting very aggressive policies in place around capital, immigration, other kinds of things. So I just applaud these 4 senators who aren't sitting it out, even though there are people, I'm sure, in both their parties who wish to just to kind of, why don't you just go on sabbatical while we fight out this election. They're saying, no, we have work to do. The American people expect people in Congress to do the work. The most important work is around the economy and jobs. The most important place to focus is around entrepreneurship, and the Startup Act 2.0 does that.
Last question.
You're part of to get to your point of working in a campaign environment, you're part of the gang of 8. That's something that the president has embraced. How often has he reached out to the group directly? And was that viewed as a positive development or something that could possibly tarnish a bipartisan congressional product?
Well, I can tell you that those of us who are concerned about the fiscal cliff, and I think Jerry mentioned that what brought him to this issue in the first place was our debt and deficit. You know, there are a wide group of us who believe we've got to reform our tax code and reform our entitlement system. But if you dig into the numbers, you can't cut and tax your way alone out of this challenge around the debt. If you don't have the third leg of the stool, which is growing the economy, we're going to continue to confront that $16 trillion which we add $4.5 billion a day to. So if you're concerned about the debt and deficit, as all of us are, you got to have a third leg of the stool. And that third leg is growth in the economy. That means you got to create jobs. And Jobs Act was part one. This is part two. We think this will have an enormous effect. Again, traditionally politicians talk about big business or small business. The data shows, at some point you got to actually look at the facts. The data shows that the startup businesses are doing this. There's nothing that'll be more important for startup businesses. There'll be nothing that'll be more important for technology businesses. There'll be nothing that'll be more important for the kind of innovation economy than passing this legislation.
So when was the last time you talked to the president about that?
When was the last time I talked to the president about that? I saw him a couple weeks ago. And I think he is very supportive of an innovation approach, and I continue to tell him we are hard away, a gang of not 6 or 8, 45 in the Senate and 102 in the House, and hopefully a majority before the end of the year. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. We don't have the luxury of waiting. In the short 15 months that I've been a member of the United States Senate, 9 other countries have passed legislation similar to what we are doing here, and the talent and the capital will go elsewhere, and we will not be able to have a future and Americans be able to pursue the American dream. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Great. Appreciate it.